Hello and welcome to another episode of the G.I. Joe New News Review. I am David Allen. This interview was originally planned for 3D Joes, but due to unforeseen circumstances, the interview will now be presented here instead for your viewing pleasure. I hope you enjoy. Hello, welcome to another episode of the New News G.I. Joe New News Review. I am joined by my extremely special guest, Flint Dille, writer, screenwriter, game designer, novelist, story editor, and producer. And there's so many more credits that he's done over the decades. I can't list all the things that this gentleman has done in media. Thank you for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Oh, great to be here. Great to be here.
So I'm gonna go through a few of your credits, the highlights of your credits. I can't, like I said earlier, I can't list all the work that you've done. You've done so much work. It's unbelievable.
Some of it's embarrassing, so we'll stay away from that stuff.
So first off, I want to jump into something that's interesting that I found researching you. You were born in Chicago, Illinois. But you had difficulties with reading and learning as a child. You had dyslexia, and I found this interesting aspect of your life, that you had difficulties reading and difficulties learning, and you had dyslexia, but you become a writer, a world-class writer. How do you overcome a hardship like that? You know, they say that there's no what's that saying? There's no hardship or something that can keep you down if you want to accomplish any goal in life or whatever. Some saying, I can't think of the exact thing, but that was kind of interesting to me, that you took a negative and made it into a positive.
Well, yeah, I mean, okay, well, let's give my parents credit for that, because, it's like they took me to, the local, the public schools, which were really good at that time, and they gave me all the tests, right? And I remember this woman saying, well, we're not really going to be able to teach him to read, but we'll be able to teach him to write his name and recognize symbols and stuff. He can recognize certain words. And I remember thinking, that's stupid. Those were primitive times. I had dyslexia and then a thing called mixed dominance, and was at the time called hyperkinetic, which we now call ADHD. And I was basically a problem kid, let me put it that way. And so they found a reading program. I went to a school called North Shore Country Day, and they found it was called the Gillingham Method. And just extremely indulgent parents. I mean, like if I wanted comic books, if I'd read it, they'd get it for me. Mad Magazine, when it was like banned in the neighborhood, not a problem. If I'd read it, they'd get pretty much anything I wanted. And, you catch on to it. And then I started writing, and I never thought that I wouldn't be able to write. The diagnosis, the prognosis didn't seem right to me. I just used to write in mirror writing. I still do it sometimes, like in the middle of the night. If I write something down, I'll look at it and like, oh, it's backwards. And so they just worked hard on it and got through it. And yeah, you end up being like a kid that burns his legs and then breaks the 8-minute mile, because you take off, because you want to do it.
Right. I was born deaf as a child, and I had similar difficulties learning, trying to adapt and how to speak in sign language, things like that. And so I kind of see where you're coming from and stuff, where the teachers, the school, they were like, oh, no, this kid, there's nothing we can do, he's done, whatever. But our parents don't feel that way, and they help us, and they try to get us the best help and things like that. And I kind of say that reading comics kind of saved me. And you said in your book that the golden age is what, for a 12-year-old?
Oh, that was a joke Jack Kirby made. I was working with him. I didn't even know it was Jack Kirby at that moment, but I was working with him at Ruby Spears, and he was saying, when the golden age of comics is, and I'm thinking, I know this is a trick, because like everybody else, there was a big comics expert. I wasn't. And I mean, I read them when I was a kid, like, normal kid amounts, but I'm sitting there. Steve Gerber is working with me on Mr. T, which you see in the background, Marty Pasco, real comics guys. And, I said, I don't know, the 40s? I was just guessing because I was thinking that's when Captain America came. And he said, no, 12. And his point being, when you're 12 years old, whatever you like then, so you think's the golden age of comics. And it's kind of point.
And I agree with that. When I read that, I was like, that's true, because that was the golden age of comics for me. I read G.I. Joe, and it's coincidental, but comics helped me become who I am today, and I'm still avid comic reader and stuff like that. So I can see how you had to go through your childhood and the things that you had to deal with and stuff like that. So I admire you for that, and I give you my admiration for overcoming that.
Yeah, well, you don't have a
kids
choice,
left
right?
behind.
You kind of have to. Plus, the fact you're a kid, you don't know it. I always figured there was something wrong with it. I asked my mother much later. I said, "Do you think I was like the word they used then was? Did you think I was retarded?" And she said, "No, you could always talk, and you were funny, and you always won at games. With other kids. It says, oh, okay." but yeah, it was kind of defective.
So I'm going to go through a few of your credits. I can't, like I said earlier, I can't cover all the credits you've done, but I'm going to try and cover the highlights. And then we'll touch on some of this stuff as we go along, because there's some really interesting stuff in your past and your history that I think people would find fascinating that they probably don't know. So let's see, I'm going to start with video games. You did Scooby-Doo, Unmasked, Teen Titans, Transformers, The Game, Tomorrow Never Dies. You've done 47 games at the point where I did this research. You may have done more now since I got this list. 47 games, designed 47 games. That's a lot of games.
Well, what's interesting is that doesn't count board games, and it doesn't count games that aren't for sale. Like, I did, I think you have it somewhere right behind you, the Buck Rogers game there.
That's the DVD.
I did the one with Gil Gerard on it. I did not do that one. But I did a whole series of Buck Rogers games, and we got Sci-Fi Fantasy Game of the Year with Battle for the Future. That was the 25C series. That was with TSR. And I got the rights to 25C back. We have a lot of legal issues with Buck Rogers, but I got the 25C rights back. So I may do something with that one of these days. And then Line in the Sand, which is what started all the military stuff that I did, which was a Gulf War game. It was released the day the Gulf War started. And SSI made a computer game out of it, but I had nothing to do with that. I mean, it was made from our game design, but I didn't make the computer game.
So
and then at the other end of my career was all the Niantic stuff. Like, you can't count Ingress because it's not for sale. You can't count Pokemon Go. You can't count any of that stuff because it's a different kind of. It's not a commercial product. So yeah, so there's a lot of stuff, a lot of things.
So then, some of your highlights in books and authoring, the Games Master, Life in the 80s, the book that you showed earlier, The Ultimate Guide to Video Game Writing, Transformers, Monstrosity, the Autocracy series, Primacy,
Yeah,
Crimson.
I have that right here. That's an interesting one because I did it with Chris Metzen, right? And Chris Metzen was creative lead is back there now. I had Blizzard at the time, and we were doing Diablo 3. And one day he said, "Hey, you want to do a Transformers graphic novel?" He was a big fan of all this stuff. And I said, "Yeah, sure." Well, we thought we were doing 22 pages and out, and that'll be fun. 4 years and this many pages later, we get done with this trilogy. And at that point, we were both pretty deep in.
Your Sagard series, Green Hydra, Crimson Sea, are just the tip of the iceberg for that.
I wrote those with Gary Gygax, and we're talking about reprinting those things too. That'll be cool.
Agent 13 series,
Yeah.
Arrival, and Batman Rise of Sin.
Right. Yeah, Rise of Sin Tzu was actually the novelization of a video game script I wrote. And what happened, I was working with John Nee at Warner's, and he was brand assurance, but he handled the video games. And so we did he said, I'm kind of sick of the Joker. Let's do something else. So he brings in Jim Lee, and Jim Lee and I, and then I got a lot of help from, Frank Miller and Paul Dini, and those guys helped me out with, because they did a lot of Batman. I mean, in relation to them, I'm like a novice, but, and yeah, so and then the game didn't really get the whole script in there. So they said, let's do a novel of it because it's a really good story. So that was it. And Devin Grayson co-wrote it with me,
Wow,
meaning he transformed that game script into a novel. And I wrote the parts with the new villain in it.
cool. Worked with some really heavy hitters in the comic book world there.
Yeah, well, certainly, yeah. I mean, in the Batman world, that's for damn sure. Yeah.
Some TV shows that you worked on, Inhumanoids, and then the Inhumanoids movie. I have Inhumanoids up there.
Yeah, in humanoids, I'm doing a thing called Subterraneans now, and it's not in humanoids, but I mean it's sort of unfinished business I had with that, and various different Hollow Earth things I've done in the past. We did some for Agent 13, and so now that's my Hollow Earth thing. I'm working with Jay Parker on that now, so it'll come out one of these days. Play
Cool.
tested at GaryCon year before last, and so we're working on it.
So some other TV shows you worked for, of course, you worked on Transformers, you worked on Starship Troopers, Venom, Tiny Toons, An American Tale, Bigfoot Muscle, Garbage Pail Kids, Dragons Strike, Robo Force. You were the
Yeah, it's a
creative.
lot of stuff. Yeah.
That's why I said I'm not going to be able to list everything that you've done because you've done so much. You've been a prolific creator and writer since you started doing this. It's like you've never stopped.
Yeah, no, that's the whole thing. The whole thing is to keep going, everyone, and then you have these periods where you say, well, God, I got to like start over, which is always leads to good stuff.
You were the creative lead at Google's Ingress mobile games. You were
Right, that turned into a company called Niantic,
okay.
and we were a startup inside of Google.
You were authoring Social Storm for DARPA. That was a
Yeah.
surprise when I saw that. DARPA, holy cow!
Yeah, I've done a lot of stuff for DARPA, for the military, and parts of the intelligence community and all that. Mostly during the War on Terror. Social Storm was kind of weirdly prescient. It was about ability to manipulate media and create false narratives and all that. That was
Like
cool.
we haven't been seeing that the last 5 years.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my project head was way ahead of the world. I think Rand Walsman. He was
I hope
way
they
ahead.
didn't read your thing and say, "Good, we could use this."
Yeah, you got to be careful what ideas you have.
You're a director of a film, Terror Tracks.
Yeah,
And then you had the game script of the year for Riddick.
yeah. It was Butcher Bay. Did that with John Platten.
So that's just, like I said, the highlights, but there's so many more things that you worked on. I can't really cover everything because you've said a bunch of other stuff just in this little segment of things that weren't even on my list. But I don't know how you get up every morning with all this stuff that you have to do.
First of all, this is all done over a period of 40 years, right? It's a long time. I just gotten out of film school when I was doing Mr. T and Transformers and G.I. Joe, and I was working on Droids and Ewoks at Lucasfilm and stuff like that. So I mean, that was say I started reasonably young and just kept at it. And you have to change businesses and stuff like that all the time.
Right. So I'm sure you've been asked about this a million times. This is why I put this behind me, or this way.
Yeah.
Buck Rogers. That's the box set for the DVD, not the game.
Yeah, for the DVD, yes. But underneath it, is that a Buck Rogers module underneath it? I think that may be a game module.
It's an action figure.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
That's a G.I. Joe action figure down there.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah. Yeah, it was funny. It looks like one of our modules.
I had to mention it. I know you've probably been asked a million times about it, but I had to because I'm a huge Buck Rogers, the old pulp type stuff. When you think of pulp, and when I think of pulp is probably different. I'm thinking of like old serial type stuff, old sci-fi, Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, Zorro, the Lone Ranger, the Green Hornet, all that type of stuff, the Phantom, all that. That's what I think of when I think of pulp. And
Right.
your pulp is probably the hard-boiled detective type pulp, which they're both
Well,
pulps.
but it's all pulp. I mean, that's the thing. It's all the same stuff. I mean, and it comes in like four different forms. There's the pulp magazines, right? And that gives you everything from, I mean, every, writer we find interesting started out there. I mean, that was, Robert E. Howard world, Ray Bradbury world, Robert Heinlein world, H.P. Lovecraft world. I mean, that was, I mean, to me, all of Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, all that stuff was pulp. And then it started, and then you have the serials, which overlap with pulp. Then you have Buck Rogers, who started out as comic strip, and Flash Gordon, right? But they sort of merged into pulp and serials and all of that. And my theory on pulp is it's sort of split into two families, right? Half of it becomes, hard-boiled, detectives and kind of science fiction novels, and the other half of it becomes comic books. You know what I mean? And you look at the Shadow, which is a fascinating character in that they're all called the Shadow, and somehow Lamont Cranston's in all of them. But some of them, he's this visual guy, and other ones nobody ever sees him. Like the radio shows, and yeah. So yeah, no, I love pulp. So, and that's the Agent 13 novel. I'm pretty much everything I've ever done, if I'm honest about it, one way or another goes back to pulp. But Agent 13 was one year I went to Comic-Con, and I'm like buying all these, like they sold them those days for like $10 or $20. You just buy these pulp magazines from the 30s and 40s. And I started reading them and I was like, this stuff's great. And I showed it to Dave Marconi, who's a director. He did Enemy of the State and a bunch of, but he's a friend of mine at that moment, living on my floor because he was a very hot screenwriter. And so he just like pitch a story like somewhere in the world, like you wanted to go wherever you wanted to go. I want to go to like, the Riviera. And so he pitched some Riviera story in his studio to give him money. So he didn't really live anywhere. He was just, he'd just show up in LA to have meetings and then go wherever he was writing stories. But anyway, I showed it to him. I said, is this stuff really great, or is it my imagination? And he said, wow. And so that's when we created Agent 13. We just loved it.
But I love Buck Rogers. I love that stuff. So I can't imagine having my grandfather be the creator of Buck Rogers. And you must have heard all kinds of awesome stories and been able to like bend his ear and just ask him any question. Was that something that you even had a inkling of when you were growing up, that you could do something like that?
Well, I mean, what's funny, it works slightly differently than that. Yeah, I'm growing up and we had a bunch of stuff. I've got a lot of it in my house, like old ray guns and rocket ships and things like that. And I'm growing up and that's just sort of sitting in my house and in my dad's office, right? He had a newspaper syndicate in Chicago. And yeah, but I didn't really know that much about Buck Rogers. We're talking about like I'm at 5 and 6. But I would sort of read it when they were trying to teach me how to read. We'd go through that and everything else too. It wasn't just that. He syndicated a lot of stuff, like I'd read Marmaduke and things like that. And so that was always just kind of a fact of my life. But the first time I remember the serial came on TV, and I remember my sister and my cousin were saying that your grandfather created that. And I have like one probably real, but possibly manufactured memory of him because he died when I was like almost 2.
Oh.
The only reason I believe it's a real memory is I remember like the shot I have of it's looking up from, the ground. And like when you get older, your brain changes so that it, you manufacture images, but things you have in early childhood, you see POV. Just kind of interesting. So I believe that to be a real image. But then last year, and I had to do something with it. Last year, my sister asked me to write a bio, piece about my grandfather. And I realized I know very little about him. I mean, I have a collection of family stories. So I started assembling it and put together like my bio just from publicly known facts, things I remembered, what my sister knows. I remember talking to Murphy Anderson. He was a comics. He did Buck Rogers for a while. And I ran into him at Comic Con. He's since passed on, but yeah, not that long ago. Before COVID, but not that long. Um, and he was one of the few people I knew who actually knew him. Other than my uncle had, and my cousins, and so I kind of put together this composite biography of him. It was kind of interesting putting together a biography of somebody you only vaguely knew, but share a genetic code with. But like, it's not an accident that he did that, and then I was doing Transformers, 30 years later, 40 years later, however long later.
You got the gene.
Yeah, I mean, it's DNA, right? It's like, and I remember I had a summer job where what my job was, my father assigned me this, was to read every Buck Rogers comic strip for 40 years.
Wow.
Right. I'm sitting around in a building. It looks like something out of an old Batman, out of Gotham City, in the basement, literally in the storage room where there's a light bulb hanging down. And I'm sitting there reading, boxes and boxes of Buck Rogers dailies. I just look at the ideas, and there's certain things in there I realize, yeah, that's the kind of thing I'd think of. So I have this theory, totally unfounded by anything, that a lot of your creativity is just genetic. You know what I mean? I mean, it came with the package, because it's not like I studied it when I was a little kid or anything. It was just there.
Wow, I would have loved that. Gosh, what a childhood.
It's kind of a fun job because you're sitting there. I mean, the storage room is like the very small version, but it was like this Raiders of the Lost Ark, storage room underneath this. It's a civic opera building in Chicago. I mean, it's what I always envisioned where Thomas and Martha Wayne were when Crime Alley's right behind it.
Yeah. Wow. I can't believe that. Gosh, that's you only hear about stories like that, like fourth, fifth hand. You never realize things like that when you're growing up and you can experience stuff like that because.
Well, and when you grow up with stuff like that, you never grew up having somebody else's life.
Yeah.
So you don't, you just kind of assume everybody's life was. I mean, my life was like almost indistinguishable. And I realize this more and more as I get older and look back. And then when I became a parent, you think a lot about your kids' lives and stuff. And like my life was almost indistinguishable from like the TV I was watching. My dad had the Lincoln. Yeah. It got chopped to be the Batmobile. It was I mean, that was a Lincoln Futura that they modded, but it was all based on the Continental. So we're driving around in this car that was just like the Batmobile, like real people, that's not their life, but you assume that's everybody's life, right?
But now your daughter, she's going to go look back, heaven forbid anything happen, but you're like kind of fairly well known for quite a few things over your life, and she's going to have people like me dragging her on TV, asking her, "Hey, what happened to Flint Dille when he wrote Transformers?" Blah blah blah.
I'll tell you the funniest daughter story. I have a son and a daughter. This is a daughter story. This is like because like I mean they didn't pay much attention to what I did, but Gwenna went to Comic-Con with me a couple of years. She was Frank Miller's PA, for a couple of years, so she got to see that world, but then she went to art college. And she went to a place called Rhode Island School of Design. It's called RISD. And they used the book you were talking about, the game writing book, in their new media program. And one of the girls from the school comes up to the table and says, "You realize your father's the coolest guy in the world, right?" Gwenna turns, the girl across the table from her is Eric Clapton's daughter, right? And they assume we're talking about her. Oh my God. Talking about me. So for 1 minute, at one table at one college, I was as cool as Eric Clapton. That's all I need.
That's cool. So I'm going to get in. This is a daunting task. I'm going to try and break your career down into some segments here. And we're going to probably have to cover these segments fairly quickly because it's so much. But you did some work at Sega. You worked on the first video game, Double Switch, with Rob Fuller.
Yeah, there's actually that's a more interesting story than that. I don't mean to stop you, but I mean, Double Switch was actually I did that, and there was a game called Night Trap, which I was only there for the very end of Night Trap. But that got famous and controversial because Joe Lieberman was waving it around the House of Representatives and totally misrepresenting what it was. But that was actually Hasbro when I did it. And Hasbro had a project called ISIX, and this was after all the Sunbow stuff. It's probably 2 years later. And they had it was a thing that read a VHS tape and saw it in 4 tracks, and it could jump between the tracks. And then there was a video game that kind of glued the stuff together. Double Switch was really early. Then ISIX never fully happened, and a guy named Tom Zito bought all the rights to everything, and then created Digital Pictures, which is where we shot Double Switch. And yeah, we had Debbie Harry. Blondie was in it. I mean, that was cool.
She's a great singer.
Yeah, absolutely great singer, and like just an icon of the '80s. You don't get more, pure icon of the '80s than Blondie in say 1982.
I remember her in Wise Guy, and I'm like,
yep.
She's an incredible actress in the '80s. That dates me to the '80s, but obviously I'm talking about all this stuff, so I guess it doesn't. But yeah, she was a really good actress.
Yes, she was. Yeah, she was, and she's still around. She's probably still doing stuff. I think she just did. What'd she do? She did a song with like Dolly Parton, like I heard last week. Kind of interesting. They did a version of "Call Me," I think.
Yeah. Let's see. So then you did Coleco Adam. You worked on that, which is a two birds and one stone Planet of Zoom.
Yeah, well, no, yeah, Planet of Zoom. That became the Buck Rogers game. Sega licensed Buck Rogers from us, and it was my agent that set it up. Yeah, it was Buck Rogers Planet of Zoom, but I think in Japan it was known as Planet of Zoom. My agent set it up, and it was great because we got a big advance on it. And I figured, I can pay my parents back for all the profligate spending of my my childhood and 20s.
And then, of course, your collaboration with Gary Gygax.
Yeah.
Game designer, world building, all the stuff you did there. And I know a lot of this crosses over back and forth because you were doing a lot of it at the same time.
Yeah.
He was like, I guess at the time in California, it was the mecca for D&D role playing design and games and stuff. You were involved in all that?
Always Geneva, Wisconsin, but he came out to California to get D&D into movies and TV, and they had the animated show, and he bought or he didn't buy, he rented King Vidor's old mansion, which they're doing a documentary about D&D about Gary created Dungeons and Dragons for anybody who doesn't know,
right.
And so he rented out this mansion. And it was some of the most fun times of my life. We converted a stable into our creative offices, and we had like a 16-foot by 8-foot sand table, not a really big one, because Gary had 3,000 Elastilon fully painted medieval miniatures, like of every type. I mean, he had Templars, Druids, Janissaries, all of the Saxons. He had all sorts of stuff. So we just like play endless chainmail. There's kind of always this game just kind of always going.
Now, as wonderful as the beginning of that whole thing is, it kind of ended on a sour note with the anti-violence situation with Thomas Verdicki. And then the steam tunnel never came out, the last game.
Well, what's funny is, what happened was, Thomas Verdecki, he was this weird guy who, back in the 80s, I mean, because he crossed in pretty much everything I did. I mean, he'd be complaining about G.I. Joe, he'd be complaining about Transformers, he'd be complaining about Inhumanoids, things like that. And Gary Gygax and I were on a Michael Jackson's radio show, not Michael Jackson, the singer, but there was a LA radio host named Michael Jackson. And Thomas Verdecki calls. And he's really this righteous wiener psychiatrist. who is, I believe, was or is in jail for inappropriate actions with his patients, and turned out to be a real trench coat. But you know, at the time, he was the guardian of moral purity and psychiatric well-being. Yeah. So yeah, he was a real pest in those days. But it didn't really. I don't know that netted out to being bad. I mean, making D&D controversial, was part of what made it famous.
There's no that old saying. There's no negative press, right? Or there's no such thing as negative press.
As long as you spell my name right, that's the old line.
I was going to say a bad joke, but I don't think I will on here. It's a political bad joke, but I won't. I won't go there.
Yeah, we're pretty G-rated here.
So then, from what I understand, your first script was puppies in the Badlands.
Wow, yeah, you really did. That was my first script. There was a show called The Puppy. Here's what's really weird about it is that that was the successful show at the time. It was Ruby Spears, because my boss was Joe Ruby, and he and his partner Ken Spears created Scooby Doo. So they got their own animation studio, and rightfully so. And they sold The Puppy was a show that they sold. It was on, I think, for at least 3 seasons on network TV. It did really well, and like millions of people watched network TV. I mean, Saturday morning you had like 3 network. This before cable, really. And but then these shows disappear without a trace. Then you have the far more obscure syndicated shows we did, like G.I. Joe and Transformers, and their conventions for them. It's interesting to me. But anyway, yeah, The Puppy in the Badlands, which was a pretty naked retelling of North by Northwest with dogs. I didn't write the outline. I just wrote the script. That was my first produced script.
Now, from what I understand from Michael Charles Hill, you started a writing group yourself, and you were going around town as a group trying to get hired, but you didn't get hired. As a group, they liked you, and you got hired because you were charismatic and outgoing, and they liked your personality. Is that accurate?
Well, I mean, what happened? Well, yeah, I mean, every individual component of it is accurate, but it didn't. At the time, it didn't seem like it was happening that way. I met Michael Charles Hill, a really good guy, when he was a friend of mine, a guy named Tony Cinciarpini, and we were like, we were sort of Hollywood gorillas. We'd be out being, hey, I'm an assistant art director this week. Oh, I'm a production assistant. And we had a script reading business. Okay. Cause I was reading scripts, even when I was a student. I went to SC Film School, USC. And I was reading scripts then because I figured it was a good way to get in and meet people and all that. And we had a business doing that. And Mike read some of them. And we were all writing stuff together and trying to get movies made and doing low budget horror films, and trying to do that, and everything that in the 80s people out of film school did, right?
Yeah.
And we had a risk game too that every Sunday night that went on for like 10 years, which is a long time. I think it was till I got married. And people got married and moved and had kids, and life got complicated. But anyway, back in the days when life wasn't complicated, and so we went around. What happened was I was at film school. I got I won a screenwriting contest, and so that got me an agent. Okay, and my agent, one guy introduced he didn't actually do anything for me, but he introduced me to a guy who introduced me to a guy who did a lot for me. Yeah, it was a guy that introduced me to both Gary Gygax and George Lucas. But anyway, so and I also met Joe Ruby then, and I'd written a Spec Buck Rogers script for the TV series, right? And so he read that and he said, "You want to do development for a couple of weeks at Ruby Spears?" And I said, "Sure." And I didn't even know. I've been all the way through film school. I had no idea what development was. I'd never heard of that. But I mean, if I was going to get to write and get paid for it, I'm in. It's only going to last 2 weeks anyway. And then it just kept going on and on and on. It's gone on till about now.
Um, so then you get into Saturday mornings with Ruby Spears. You
Yep.
you 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 curtailed my questions, and you got to work on Mr. T. I pity the fool.
I'll pity the fool. Yeah, yeah. That Mr. T made my career. I mean, what can I say? I mean, I mean that show. That's when I'd written Puppy in the Badlands before that, but I didn't really know animation format. Because I was just out of film school, and so I wrote it like a screenplay. I didn't know there was 2 pages per. I mean, somebody told me, and I did it. But I really worked. It was Marty Pasco, who is a pretty famous comic writer and did a lot of other stuff, and Steve Gerber developed the show and were the story editors. And they really sort of took me under their wing, and I was writing. I worked on I think first Mr. T I worked on I think was the Forbidden Monastery and all that, but the third one was what is that? That has all the episodes? It was the 100-Year-Old Mystery that just made me. I mean, I wrote that. It was kind of a spooky New Orleans story, and the NBC executives just thought it was great and said he must write all further episodes, right? And I'm a complete rookie novice being made look good by Marty Pasco and Steve Gerber and Mark Jones and Cliff and Alana, Cliff Ruby and Alana Lesser. I mean, but nevertheless, there we go. That was it. That made me. And then it was how I got into the Writers Guild too, because they had the live action interstitials, which were treated like half-hour episodes, even though they were like 30 seconds long. But that was just union rules.
So then you join I guess the advertising group Griffin Bacall to do Sunbow, and that's where all the people watching this is probably most familiar with you on that work.
Well, what's interesting is, okay, in between there was this short and disastrous experience. What I thought at the time was disastrous at Lucasfilm, where Paul Dini and I went up there to do Droids and Ewoks. And I did the Bible for Droids, maybe a pilot, I can't really remember. And that wasn't working out. I came back to LA feeling like, oh, my career's over. And Gerber called me up and said, hey, I'm doing this thing called G.I. Joe, and the characters can hit each other with real fists. And I'm in. And I was also finishing the Sagard books with Gary at that moment too. So the rest of the period, all the Dungeon and Dragon stuff and the Sunbow stuff is blurry. And I mean, even that entire period was all. I could spend the morning at Sunbow and the afternoon at D&D and stuff like that.
So this is kind of a mixed bag of stuff because I know you were a producer and you were a script writer, but you did pretty much anything that needed to be done at Sunbow, from what I understand. And you were a jack of all trades. You just did what needed to be done.
Well, that's the way Sunbow worked, and that's the way Joe and Tom worked. I mean, you have to figure Sunbow was just. I've never played on a better team than Sunbow. I played on pretty great teams, but that's as good as his team can get. I mean, Joe and Tom were at that moment the highest, which was Griffin and Bacall, Tom Griffin and Joe Bacall, were the fastest growing ad agency in Manhattan at that moment, and they were like probably generationally they would have been like the young guys in what's a Madison Avenue show, Mad Men, right? They would have been like that. It's when advertising was really something. And I meet some of the old guys, but Joe and Tom were relatively young. Joe's son Jay Bacall was the creative director, and he was just absolutely brilliant. He just graduated from Harvard and got saddled with, hey, guess what, Jay? You're producing 160 shows this year. Like, nobody told him he couldn't do that. And I'd been a ghost story editing, not ghost in that everybody knew I was doing it, but helping Steve Gerber get caught up because Steve was not great with deadlines. Absolutely brilliant, but getting caught up on G.I. Joe, and they said, hey, we want to hire you to be an associate producer. And I thought, oh, that sounds like fun. So that was probably after about 3 months of story editing on G.I. Joe. And so I was still a story editor on GI Joe. Then I was associate producer, meaning I went to the recording sessions, went over the boards, went to the mixing sessions, went to the sweetening sessions, the editorial. I kind of followed the episodes all along. But we had at that point, I think there were 65 episodes that year. So, you'd be doing the final part of one episode while you're doing the preface for another episode. It was pretty consuming.
It's a daunting task. I know you worked with a few people, obviously Steve Gerber, Michael Charles Hill, Buzz Dixon, and Ron
Yeah,
Friedman.
yeah.
Ron Friedman did the pilot, and I believe he hit the pilot out of the park because it caught me. It was on at the time Nickelodeon.
Pilot for GI Joe. I don't care. Go to any screenwriting class you want to go to. You just look at what Ron accomplished inside 5 minutes of the pilot. You understand why the GI Joe team needs to exist, who the enemy is, what the world is, what all the possibilities in there are, and he does it unbelievably economically, incredibly well, and you get to know the characters. Ron Friedman is a brilliant guy. I mean, I know him well now, but yeah, at the time I never met him.
I've been trying to get an interview with him, but we'll see how that goes.
What?
It's like a 101, a class on storytelling.
Yep.
When you have a good writer and a good storyteller, you don't need anything else. I'm more of a comic book guy. I come from that background, but they say if you can tell all the facts of this world in like the first couple of pages of a comic, any comic is somebody's first comic, so you can hook them. That's good storytelling. That's the way it's supposed to be done. That's
No, that's what Ron did. Absolutely. I mean, you just look at the people who worked on that stuff, and in many cases, what they would later go on to do. And it was an unbelievably gifted collection of people. And Ron was like, because it was about, it was heavily, the Sunbow staff was heavily comic book influenced.
Right.
Certainly, Steve, Marty, then he brought Marv Wolfman in later on, and Len Wein. And much later, I'd meet, not much later, but when I was working on the Transformer movie, he just brought Frank Miller in for lunch. I mean, this was like, just incredible comic book people. Some Howard Chaykin and show up. I met him at a party in that period. Roger Slifer. And I'm leaving people out. Then there were guys like Paul Dini. Buzz Dixon had, I think, done some comics, but he was really a animation guy at that moment. But yeah, enough him. Steve later said, yeah, Joe's, studio would still be going if you continue listening to Buzz's third idea. Buzz had come up with these outlandish, appalling ideas, and you just like, oh, stop. But if you listen for the third one, it was always really great. And he's still doing stuff. I just saw him a couple weeks ago.
And great guy.
Yeah, Buzz is fabulous. And he was, he taught me a lot of stuff moving along. I mean, I thought of him as, I guess really, he was probably, more veteran than any of those guys in animation, but I never thought of him all that way. I thought of him as being like my age, whereas Steve and Marty felt like they were older.
Right.
Paul Dini felt like the same as me, but he'd actually went all the way back to Masters of the Universe. I think even before that. Isn't Clyde Hill? Everybody at that company, and I'm leaving people out. Doug Booth had a long career, and he was sort of my twin employee. He went when I went to GI Joe, he went to Transformers.
You have had a very lucky career at parties. Of all these parties that you go to, and you just find a new job at every freaking party, and it's a better job than you had the previous before. I'm like, I need to just go with you to every party you go to.
Yeah, nobody invites me anymore. Post COVID, it's like you don't get invited to parties, so it's like it's a career-ending injury. What can I tell you?
Some of your highlights on at Sunbow, the Five Faces of Darkness, Game Masters, Skeletons in the Closet, obviously the Transformers movie, and the G.I. Joe movie. I think you took a pass with Buzz Dixon on that after
Yeah.
Ron Friedman.
No, no, yeah, I had very little to do. I mean, I'm sure I was in meetings and gave notes and jammed ideas with them, but I had very little to do with the that's really Buzz and trying to remember who else because I mean I think Buzz viewed it as somebody interfering with him, but there were other people involved in it.
So, what were the things that you can recall, the highlights of that time that made you excited, that kind of got you going, drove you? Because I know Buzz and Michael, they had some crazy ideas, and they had to bring them back. Some of these ideas were just not uh,
Yeah, I mean,
producible.
like any world in which I'm the straight man, that's got to tell you something about the world, right?
Yeah,
I mean, like that era, everything was exciting. It was just, I mean, like you'd go to the voice recording sessions, and these are like the best voice guys in the world. I mean, Frank Welker's a freak. It's Greg Berger is incredibly fun to work with, and Chris Latta he was probably the guy that gave us our voice and more than anybody, Michael Bell. I mean, a matter of fact, I shouldn't name any of them because I'm going to forget to name people. They're all fabulous. And as were the women, Sue Blue and Morgan Lofting, and those. I mean, so you're the best voice actors in the world. Wally was a character and a half. He was like a military guy. I think he was like a tank guy. And so he got GI Joe at that level, but he also got to wrangle a lot of extremely chaotic people. The Marvel producers were great. I mean, it was just a charm time. I mean, and so the voice recordings were great. The editorial, I was always getting in trouble, fairly or unfairly, with Marvel because I think they were just offended that Sunbow had producers and we'd have stuff to do. And I never really understood that. I mean, it was never explained to me, and certainly nobody at Sunbow behaved like it. But we were the client, so when I'm sitting in the recording session, I'm paying for it. I mean, I represent that part of it, and so people have to listen to this idiot, who just gotten out of film school, basically. And but we all figured it out, and I think everybody remembers it well. We did a lot of pretty experimental stuff at the time, just because I didn't know any other way to do it. Like, they'd always try to get every line clear, but that doesn't allow the actors to bounce off each other. So I said, why don't we just record this ensemble? And I didn't understand what the resistance was, and that was my friend Gordon Kent, who is great. He's since passed on, but Gordon Kent said, well, Flint, there's this thing called perfect pause that they did at Hanna-Barbera, which was if you take a second between every line of dialogue, you save a second of animation for every line of dialogue. In the course of an episode, that can be 2 minutes, right?
wow.
And so it's 2 minutes less animation. We didn't do that at Sunbow. We had a completely different process. And also the tech guys tended to like to have clean lines. But I didn't find that was the best performance because real people step on each other all the time. And so we'd record it both ways and whenever possible use the ensemble stuff.
Cool. Now, this is a bit of a tricky topic because I am the demographic that this was aimed at. I was a child, a teenage child in the 80s that this was aimed at, but it was considered lowbrow, disreputable material, and it was regulated cartoons that were done through the pro-social groups, Cultural Impact, by who was the lady that did all that back in the 80s?
Oh, Peggy Sharon.
Peggy Sharon, yeah.
Right.
And so I kind of say she's wrong because I didn't turn out to be a mass murderer. You see all these toys behind me. You see, I can hold a conversation. I can talk. I have a job. So you were wrong, but I can see the situation where it was toys, advertising, toys, it's a whole messy circle.
And that was the Reagan administration deregulated cable TV. And so the regulations against, you could not advertise in your own show. In other words, you couldn't have a Transformer advertisement in a Transformer episode. But the whole, basically the whole show was an advertisement, right? And the guys used to think it was really funny that the other toy companies had to advertise inside their show, right? Because that paid for the show.
Well, they got
So
around it. Didn't they get
what?
around it? Marvel Comics helped them get around it by advertising a comic.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then
No,
it became so messy, the waters became so messy that they kind of like gave up and said, the people gave up and said, nah, do whatever the hell you want to do.
well, yeah. I mean, I don't remember a glorious day when people gave up. What was interesting about Chip Peggy Sharon and Action for Children's Television is I remember Joe Ruby asked her one time, if we got everything, you got everything you want, would you just, shut down the business? And she did get everything she want, and she shut down the business. I don't think that's ever happened, before or since in the area of activism anywhere. As I said, Thomas Radecki was the other, nightmare character, ended up in jail. Yeah, I think he ended up in jail. I don't think I'm slandering him. And then there was the beginning of what we now know as kind of, political correctness. And that was more networked. We didn't really have that on the animated shows. I mean, on the syndicated shows, we didn't really need it. I mean, there's like every kind of person you can imagine, and they were all heroic in like Joe and Transformers robots. So,
Well, but that's the thing, though. I'm getting off my thing, but I'm giving a little bit of myself away in this. But my father worked. He had to take care of 4 children and my mom, put a roof over our heads, put food on the table. He was busy. He was doing stuff. Mom was doing things that mom does, making food and doing the laundry, and she had a small part. So us kids, we had the run. We went all over the town, went to the movies, got our comics, went and had adventures. We never. It was kind of like the Stranger Things kids without the monsters.
No, yeah, I mean that's exactly. 80s kids were, Gen Z. Yeah, I mean, you guys are really Gen X. I would say, maybe getting to millennial, but really Gen X, and they were called latchkey kids at the time. And that was you had both parents working, and so the kids would have an incredible amount of time to be out in the world. Which was different than boomers. Boomers were like the first generation of kids anybody ever had, where there's no purpose for them. In other words, like every other generation, you'd have kids because they're just extremely high-end farm animals, right? Or farm hands, and they were your social security, and there was everything else. But as we became an industrial civilization that stopped being after the war, you had this massive number of kids come flying out, and like there was no purpose for them. And you guys were the generation after that. But you actually got around, got to do a lot of stuff, and grew up in I mean, I'd say both of us grew up in perfect times, probably, decade and a half apart, but I mean, like in perfect times.
So, so Transformers kind of was an allegory for the energy crisis, the
Yep.
oil. I very vaguely remember us having to park on the street waiting to get to the gasoline tank.
Remember the gas lines?
Yeah, and stuff like. So I do understand this whole thing where Transformers has this allegory, but the product cycle, as it were, I guess they continued Transformers, continued GI Joe, and stuff like that. So that type of thing, I understand it from a merchandising, from a business, but as a child, it was just, okay, how many GI Joes can I get? How many Transformers can I get? What's the cool new thing coming out? And this is where I said earlier, where I'm gonna turn this particular subject in a different direction. It didn't bother me to have more Transformers and GI Joe and toys And it didn't bother me to be able to create my own world and create my own armies with this stuff that you guys were creating, the toy companies, you guys, the comic companies, for us to purchase and to do stuff with outside people, outside, not in here in this closed in environment with my little glass piece of technology. Outside.
I was just talking to a guy about that last night. Is like, certainly most of my childhood was parents, my mother basically saying go outside. She didn't much care what we did. We go outside and play football. We go outside and play with toys. Go outside and blow up all your model kits with firecrackers. Go out and sketch on the back of cars. And I mean, I by most standards, I had a fairly protective mother. But when I think of that like after school, it's outdoors. You know what I mean? And that's not really the way. Certainly, like my kids are raised. It's not like we tried to keep them from going out, but everything was just so much more organized. They didn't have like the local park where, I live in the middle of Los Angeles, but, the local park where you could go, you go play, or you just go over there and whatever people are doing, you start doing it. Oh, we're playing baseball today. Okay. Anybody have a mitt? It was like that. Whereas now it's much more organized, and and really kind of in a sad way, kind of much more professionalized. Like they're playing baseball, you're, in some kind of a league, and you have scores and you have coaches and you have fanatical parents and all that. Most of my childhood, my parents were absolutely unaware of where I was. And these were not, negligent parents. They were just typical, you know.
They were busy.
And we'd ride our bicycles wherever we happened to feel like riding them. And I think, for latchkey kids, it was like that, except you almost had enforced afternoons because that's when, mothers were working. It was just different, totally different environment.
Yep.
And yeah.
So this brings me to the topic that I totally kind of disagree with how this all happened. I know it happened a certain way out there. You can argue to your heart's content, but I view this whole subject differently. We had this.
Right. Yes. The movie. Yes.
Happen. And we had a lot of my compatriots in theaters crying, oh, we killed Optimus Prime. We had to make room for the next product line. We had to, kill all these people off so we can make room for Rodimus and Blur and Cup and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
I disagree. I obviously was sad that Optimus Prime died. He's an incredible character. I'm kind of dressed like him. I don't know if you can see the colors here.
You can see you got the Matrix right there in your shirt. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm kind of dressed like so Optimus Prime is my favorite transformer. But the story, it was a compelling story. I saw the film in the theater. I'm like, this was not cheap. This was not a cheap storytelling gimmick. Oh, no. It was not something that was thrown out there to progress the product line. As much as Hasbro and the executives and advertisers wanted us all to believe this, and I know you've been telling us this for decades, Flint, I don't think that's what it was. I love the movie. I have 10 versions of the movie, every version that's ever been released.
Oh, I mean, okay, if I've ever said anything that give anybody the impression we didn't make the best effort we could, I mean, there was Ron's first draft, which is not what you see on the internet as the first draft, in my opinion. Okay, I mean, because usually a writer will get a step deal.
I saw that documentary, the YouTube documentary about that, and I was curious about that.
I honestly, I mean, you could polygraph me, and I don't know the what was really what, because I was on GI Joe. Okay, all of a sudden one day Tom shows up and says, "Okay, we need one movie over to Transformers. Just do the Transformers you did to GI Joe." And what we'd realized with GI Joe, because they were losing to GoBots, okay, or they were
How could they be losing to GoBots?
Well, if you look at season one, and season one is excellent, but season one is much younger than season two. And what we had figured out, as per our conversation about latchkey kids and all that, is that was this all was happening in a period in the recession. Okay, there was a recession in the. I mean, the '80s were a fascinating time because in
How
one
could there
way,
be recession?
it turned around.
Oh,
Okay, but like in '83, '84, yeah, there was a recession, and so a lot of fathers were out of work. I mean, it's not like now where you just sort of borrow a bunch of money and have government jobs and slop it around, and you don't have you have like low unemployment but crap jobs, right? It's not like it wasn't like that then. People would actually, and it was when all these factories were being moved over, sold out. Go watch Wall Street, and they'll tell you what was going on in the background.
yeah. I know what
And
was going on. Yeah.
yeah, and so what we realized is these shows, they're after school. Who's watching them? Well, the kids are watching them, but their dads are watching them with them. So we realized we had to do them with one layer for the adults, one layer for the kids, and do a show that way. So they were much more sophisticated and older. Okay, that's what changed between somewhere early on in season two. It started changing. In season three, it was almost adult content, which is a whole different discussion. But and so that's part of what changed is we realized our audience is totally. We knew that with you when I was working on GI Joe, but we just took that to Transformers. And I never really I watched like Go Butts. Maybe I watched the main title and part of the first act of one, but I knew everything I need to know. That looked like a kiddie show. We weren't doing a kiddie show. And so I was on Transformers, I mean, I came on, it was pretty early in season two, because what I didn't realize is season one of Transformers was very short. Season two was very long, and season three was short. Whereas it seems to me G.I. Joe had like 3 miniseries, and then season two was long and season three was long, but they were sort of more the same length. I can be wrong about this, but I mean that was my impression at the
I
time.
believe GI Joe did have the first 3 miniseries. The third miniseries launched into season one, and
Right.
then they did another miniseries that launched season two, and then after that was the movie.
Yes. I mean, you're probably right. I mean, as I'm saying, when you're actually working on it, it's really different than when somebody's looking back at it 50 years later. I mean, because what I knew is when I came in, okay, we're doing, post on, episode 6. We're doing the speaking session on that.
Right.
We're doing the editing session on episode 7. We're doing, and the further then by episode 10, oh, we're getting premises and waiting for the script on episode 9. Yeah, I mean, I'm
No, I
putting in.
understand. I understand. It was the machine. It was
Right,
the hamburger grinder or whatever you want to call
right.
it.
And so it didn't, like when you talk to people later on, and once again, one is not right and the other is not wrong. But when you're actually in the middle of it, you're not thinking about that. I'm just thinking about how am I getting the next thing done.
Right.
You know what I mean? There's no looking back. We knew with Transformers, we knew the movie's coming up. And we knew the movie is 40 years ahead.
Right.
But if you notice the end of season 2, it becomes much more agnostic about time, and the episodes become much more mythological and abstract. Okay, a lot of like some of David Wise's stuff, who went to his grave kind of annoyed with me. He hadn't written for season 3, but that's a different case, it's conversation. Anyway, or you look at a lot of the stuff we were doing, Vector Sigma and then origin stories. That we were thinking, we were thinking more like comic book guys. Because I was saying, the entire animation business was really animation people up until, I would say, like Ruby Spears. And I can be very wrong about this, so I might be lying. Then the comic book guys started coming in. And comic book guys tended to think in terms of mythologies and storylines and continuity and all that. They were all thinking that way at that point. Meanwhile, because that was about the time Frank's doing Dark Knight, and the Alan Moore's doing Watchmen, Dave Gibbons, and people are just thinking a different way, and they always had, and they thought in terms of mythologies. And we had a heavy influence like Marvin Land and people like that. I was the only person that was really a game person, and I tended to be more obsessed about, well, how does this actually work? You know what I mean? How powerful is Megatron's gun? How much can you really do? I wanted like some kind of a like logical sense to it. GI Joe. Okay, let's just game this scene out, and what this will really look like. If you're doing it in a board game.
But that's it. Your training was in games, and
yes.
That's how you had to develop a game. You had to get all the rules up front and figure it all out, and then the story would go. So that makes sense for you that you would think that way because your training was that way.
Well, and then it all started merging together because all these guys had come up to the D&D mansion. We played chainmail, and we'd play stuff. So they got a little bit immersed in games, or we'd play D&D. And they understood role-playing games and putting characters into action. I was reading more comic books and seeing what they were doing, and we talked about that. I was an ancient history major to begin with, so I always thought in terms of mythologies and pantheons and stuff like that. So all of it began to merge together, and the product just ended up something different. You know what I mean? And so by the time and then you had the business reality that was largely invisible to us. I mean, one of the genius things about Sunbow is they almost totally insulated us from whatever was going on at Hasbro or whatever the business stuff was, except I went to Comic-Con every year. So we'd actually talk about this stuff, or like when I was rewriting the movie, when I'd written all the stuff in the morning and we'd go after in the afternoon, and then I'd go up like, hey, let's go to a copywriting meeting. We're having one upstairs. Oh, okay, we're copywriting now. And that's what was great about it. All the best companies are like that. You're just doing whatever needs to be done, right? And they sort of trust you to do it. It's not because they're new companies and they're fresh companies and they're not bureaucracies. And that was, both, that was true of both TSR and Hasbro at that moment. And so, you have the inventors there, you have the sort of pioneer guys are there, you don't have the bureaucrats. And so, things were invisible. What we would get is we would get a fax. Remember, there was no internet then. Steve Gerber, oddly enough, started the closest thing to the internet and social media we would see in the 80s with a bulletin board that we uploaded our scripts to. We could also leave messages to people, and you get these flame wars, and oh man. But anyway, and so we'd get a fax, and the fax would say, "Oh, we're discontinuing Ashtray, and we're a new character named Dipstick, so put Dipstick in here." Not real characters because I don't want to. Anyway, and Tailpipe, is out, and so we were used to things getting discontinued. We didn't kill characters in the show; you just discontinued them, right? And same thing with GI Joe. Lawn Job's gone, and yeah, and so yeah, we were used to that. I thought of them as being, and I'm not sure I was entirely wrong, but I thought of them as being like sports teams. Okay, every year, it was like, that's why all the Transformer characters in the movie were, I just pegged them to different Chicago Bears. And all the bad guys were like other teams, he had, and he had Lawrence Taylor, and but I thought of him that way, and that is every year the team changes a little bit. You know what I mean? And you some of the main guys be around, but eventually they get retired. So killing Optimus seemed like a logical extension of it. I think we knew, obviously it was a big deal to kill somebody in a cartoon show, and we'd done that. But that was a movie. You have to do something different in a movie than a TV show. It's got to be more epic, right?
Right.
And so we knew that. And and frankly, then you get the stories after the movie came out. A kid locked himself into the bathroom for a week. I'm like, I believed it. Okay.
No,
But I'm 25 years old or whatever I was at that moment.
no
And
kid did that.
I hadn't been a parent, right? Anybody that was a parent, okay, because I realized when I was a parent, my kid could, my son could have locked himself in a bathroom for, I don't know, 4 seconds, maybe five, while I'm saying, okay, open the door, and he's out of the bathroom real quickly, boom, gone, out of the bathroom. And, but nevertheless, we were believing, that story. And, I think there were a lot of things going on because you have to say there's a lot of other stuff happening, but before you have, a political environment, people believe stuff that preposterous. And, and it kind of changed everything. But I think if we hadn't, if Prime hadn't been killed, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Because I don't think anybody's having mass conversations like this, or nobody's having deep conversations about about GoBots. I mean, it just that's what changed.
I can dissect this movie till my heart's content all day long. I love the film. I think it's one of the highest benchmarks for animation feature films in the history of feature films in animation, and that's like going up against like The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, The Lion King, Aladdin, in that same era. I'm not talking about like Snow White. That was a totally different thing.
Right.
But you could, in my opinion, put this movie up against those movies. And at the time, if they had the Academy Award for animated feature film, I think Transformers would have won that year because the quality is so good. The art, the animation, the voice, the music. I play the music all the time. It's on my
The most 80s soundtrack anybody ever did. I mean, if you really, honest about it, Bush's, stuff, Vince DiCola's, prog rock stuff. That was about as 80s as you get, And I mean, they're all the famous 80s soundtracks, but the fact of the matter is this probably encompasses the feeling of the 80s better than anything. And it was yet kind of futuristic and spacey, and you actually look at, I mean, every time I see the movie, I see something different. It's I mean, one time I'm watching, I'm looking at the just surreal color choices Nelson made. I mean, how do you show a dead robot? Well, Nelson knew, take the color out of it, right? Yeah, it was impressive.
I love Dare to Be Stupid by Weird Al Yankovic. There's so much stuff. Like I said, I could go on. I watched the film probably several times a year.
Weird Al Yankovic is doing a soundtrack in a scene that Eric Idle's playing character. I mean, think about what that is. Monty Python. I mean,
so many layers.
Yeah. No, I mean, no, I think it, and it was not like every second of the film wasn't fought over and there wasn't some cage match over everything in it. And like stuff that didn't get in there for one reason or another. I threw a lot of it into Five Faces of Darkness. And I'd love to see that someday reanimated because there are whole scenes that didn't make it in because the animators didn't deliver and stuff like that. And it was just really clunky animation. And
there was a weird thing though, where in Japan they aired, I think it was one episode or 3 episodes. I can't remember exactly. I have the episodes at the end of the original G1 series, not after the movie, before the movie, that never got aired in the United States, were introduced half the cast for the feature film. And I'm like, well, if they had did this, if they had aired this episode or these episodes, would we have had all these stories of kids crying in the bathroom? I don't think so, because then you would have had a little transition to what the movie was going to be. They kind of did it with G.I. Joe. We knew who Sergeant Slaughter was. We knew who Hawk and a bunch of these characters that were in there. They introduced a couple of new characters, yes, but there was a bit of a transition from G.I. Joe season 2 to the movie, where Transformers didn't do that.
If the end of season 2 had introduced Hot Rod and Cup and all that on missions somewhere else, So you got to know them. So by the time you saw the movie, you knew they were coming and they had a backstory and a context. They weren't just new. That's interesting. It's an interesting point. That would, the truth is, that would be a fascinating series to do. Is something that takes place in between season 2 and the movie.
Well, they did those episodes. They did air in Japan. They only aired in Japan. So I have them with Japanese dubbing.
Were they done in the day?
Yes.
I didn't. I never knew they existed.
Yeah, it's either one episode or 3. I can't at the moment. I'd have to go back into my DVDs to check.
Was it Toei or was it? Because I'm sure Marvel didn't do them.
No, it was done by the same people that did the show. Everything was done by them. All the credits are the same. Everything. So this was an episode or episodes that never aired in the United States. You have to buy it as a bootleg from Japan.
I know nothing about this. So if you get a chance, send me a link or something that I can find out about it.
I'm sure it's on YouTube. Sure, it's on YouTube now because we've debated it. The fans at the community and the convention, we debate this stuff. Like, why didn't they release this here? It would have helped out with the film and this and that. It's one of those hotly debated things. I'm shocked.
What's weird about
people didn't know about it.
What's weird about it is this. And that's why I'm saying, I just don't know what just once again, just kind of haven't been there. I knew a lot of the decisions we made in the movie, we made like 10 minutes before we recorded the voice actors. Okay. And so, it's kind of like, that's all heading down that pipeline. And there's a certain amount of secrecy about it. Not that I think there was some veil of, silence, but, and we kind of make the decisions. Obviously, I don't think they had a separate recording and put, Robert Stack in there playing Ultra Magnus, but, so they had to have different casting for the characters, for the, if you had Hot Rod or Cup or Ultra Magnus or, I don't think.
And they were all in there. All those characters were in there. So they all had different voices, but they were done with Japanese voices.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that would mean to me that they must have gotten a late version of the script. Because remember, a lot of characters are being flipped in and out too. Okay. And so they had some late version of the script, and then somebody went in and did bridge episodes, which would have been a brilliant thing to do. It didn't, at the moment, it just didn't occur to us. Because I think by the time the movie came out, I was writing this 3rd season. And as a matter of fact, before the movie came out, I'm sure I was working on Five Faces of Darkness. So, it's just like, at what moment, and you figure there's probably a 9-month production window, but even with the animated series. So they would have had to, whereas the movie is much more piecemeal.
Oh, yeah.
Nelson would do, we'd send him some stuff, but he'd already have done some other stuff. That's my impression. Now, once again, my memory can be flawed on this. And there was a lot of stuff I never knew because it just didn't affect me. Exactly what the production process was and stuff like that. So much of it's stuff that you just don't know because you don't have time to think about it. It's like, and it's just that's not, my job is not to figure out what products that Hasbro is going to discontinue. It's just I'm at the effect of, they've gotten rid of Corkscrew. Okay, fine. Trash can's gone, but dumpsters here. Okay. It's kind of like I wouldn't know that, but it's hard to figure out a chronology in which they would have known to do that. And I don't know. That's why I would have suspected there was something done after the fact, but set in that time, which is equally brilliant.
So they were working on the movie before the movie came out, and the end of the previous season, somebody got a light bulb and said, we need to do something, and they did it, but it didn't make it to America. It only made it to Japan for the Japanese audience.
Remember, Nelson and that whole crew is Koreans. And the rest of the Marvel people we normally used were Japanese. and those guys did not particularly get along with each other. Not no, I'm not besmirching any individual, but to see some weird Korean Japanese collaboration would have been surprising to me at that moment.
Well, I'm gonna get my episodes after we're done, and I'm gonna try.
I would love to know. I mean, because you may be totally right. I mean, this first I've heard of it, I didn't know it, and I'm thinking, yeah, I had thought, boy, yeah, it would have been great to have stuff that introduced these characters, in there, so you would know, so you know who they were by the time they showed up in the movie.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, it may have been added as a special feature of the Headmasters, which only aired in Japan.
Right, but that's long after the fact.
Yeah,
that.
But I think they put the episode.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's a brilliant thing to do.
I believe they put them on this as a special feature. I think I'll have to look at it. I'm getting off my track. Sorry.
No, it's really interesting. I mean, rarely do I learn anything, and I mean, I learned stuff because there's just so much. Imagine how complex that project is. You have something like, by the time we were done, what was it, 139 episodes we'd done or something? And the movie, and so I mean, it's impossible to track all of that stuff. And I paid no attention to the comics. Where it was relevant, somebody would tell me what had happened in the comics.
Comics are totally different continuity. It's like the G.I. Joe comics and the Larry Hama's continuity was not Sunbow continuity. The toy continuity was not the same thing. Same thing with Transformers.
Larry Hama's stuff permeated everything.
What?
Like his characters made it into our show. We were well aware of what Larry Hama was doing because we would base bios. However, there are a lot of times you get a bio, and when you're faced with the reality, okay, I got to cast a voice actor for this, and I got to give him a personality that's different than anybody else and a voice that's different than everybody else. You know what I mean? So there'd be different things that you do, and it naturally evolved away. And they're really smart because later on, when people tried to do transmedia stuff, it always got impaled on the fact that different mediums do different things well, right?
Yep.
And that never bothered us.
Well, Larry wrote comics to be a little bit more mature than any comic book that had gone before. When I got into comics, I got into G.I. Joe, and I got into Nam, and I got into the Punisher. So I'm a weird child that I got into all these military comics of the 80s, and then got into Spider-Man and Captain America and Batman after the fact. So it's
after the fact, he went back. Yes.
Yeah. But there were the mature Batmans, like the Dark Knight and all that.
Well, what's funny is because, animation, we didn't have any of the constraints we had with networks. We couldn't do the stuff you did in the comics. We had to be very careful because, and that was the big argument when the stuff with the comics and with Marvel really hit its kind of just nasty head, and it was kind of unnecessary, was with Visionaries of all things, much later on, because there was just a reality. We had shows that even if, no matter how our show did, millions of people were watching, and you had comics that 20,000 people would read. You know what I mean? And they're different mediums.
Well, G.I. Joe is considered one of the most profitable comic books in the history of all comic books. It's up there in the top 10 of most successfully financial comics, which is very strange as a detail. This came out not too long ago, a couple years ago, when it got compiled. And I was like, you're kidding me, G.I. Joe? But then I realized in the 80s that they were reprinting that series, constantly reprinting it. So the sales, they would put in like compilation packs, and they would, all this stuff. So I guess in the hindsight, it doesn't surprise me. But a lot of children got into comics from G.I. Joe.
With the exception, put an asterisk next to the collector phase in the 90s. The 80s were the best time for comics, the best selling times, because there are comic book stores all over the place. Adults were buying them, so they were spending a lot more money. They were 12 cents when I was a kid. You know what I mean?
I
And well, the 12 rule is true. I like the really like Silver Age stuff, because I was 12.
I kind of have I have to be careful what I say about this, but I have an idea where you mentioned Mad Men earlier today and the way that you guys did business with Griffin McCall and all that stuff, advertising agents and stuff. I always thought that the story of that era of Marvel Comics from like the mid 70s, like 77 to 80, 89, that would make the perfect like Mad Men type of show, but with Marvel Comics at the time, with Jim Shooter as the protagonist at the top, and all these incredible stories, all these incredible people coming and going, and the thing.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I used to just be regaled with, I mean, like no part of me could imagine the volleyball games they had because they're all living in Hell's Kitchen. So you got like Walt Simonson, Frank Miller, Roger Slifer, maybe Marvel. I think Marvel was playing. Len Wein, Howard Chaykin playing volleyball. I can imagine giant robots and stuff. I can't imagine that. I'd pay money to see it, and that's what they were doing. These guys were hanging around together, talking about this stuff all day long. I met most all those people later on and still know some of them. But, I can't imagine what they were. I met them like 85 when Marvel they moved out. There's a funny bit. I think it remained in the final version of the Game Master, where Marv had his party, and he had this house that looked like a place that porno movies were shot in the like 70s, in the Valley. I was asking him about that the other day. It was like, Marv, remember that place? And like, but it was the moment everybody of that moment from animation and everybody of that moment from comics were all in one place at one time. It was the first time they really all encountered each other in a social situation.
It's just incredible the stories. I only get a little bit here and there from Larry, and then if you go back and you read some of the old like magazines and stuff from that period, all this, it's just like I would have loved to have been that old saying. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when all this stuff, all these crazy people were, But I'm getting off track of what I was.
No, but I totally agree with you. That is a worthy thing for somebody. Comic Book Confidential comes as close as you can come to the feeling of that, just because the people are in it when they did it.
Yeah.
But yes, I think that'd be a worthy project.
And then you could get the writers that were around. People that were comic book writers of the time: Larry Hama, Marv Wolfman, Len Wein.
You ought to have Marv on, to just tell stories. Get Howard Chaykin on; he'd be hilarious. Frank might come on, and all these guys would have something to tell. Some of them are not around anymore. Len's gone, and Roger Slifer's gone, and Walt Simonson. Get him on; he's a great guy. I never met Larry Hama until some kind of a Transformer Joe panel in like 2015. I never actually met him.
Larry Hama, his whole history is a very, I won't say tragic, but I'll say a very sad state of events for the fans and for Larry. He just got his Eisner last year, his Eisner Award. The guy deserved an Eisner Award in the 80s.
Yeah.
But he was never invited to conventions. He said he would only go to a convention if he was invited. So the first time he got invited was 2000. 2000. He wrote.
No, it's bizarre, and he must have fallen in some. I mean, I think at the time, and that doesn't mean that Joe and Transformer comics weren't doing really well, but at the time that was considered outside of comics, right?
You touched my point where I was going. It was considered a lowbrow, substandard thing to be on a toy property at the time. And Larry's quoted, I can quote this. He was the last guy at the end of the office when Jim Shooter came into his office and offered him G.I. Joe. And Larry said, if he was offering me Barbie, I would have took it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Jim Shooter, what a legendary character he is too. Yeah, and Paul Levitz, you get him. I mean, all these. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Marvel and DC, the distinctions are really blurry to me. Once you get past the '60s with Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and both of them I worked with later on in totally different contexts, but I was never around when they were both there. But I worked with Jack and Ruby Spears, and then Stan Lee later on was doing Spider-Man for ABC. We're both great guys. But I met Stan Lee when he was working at Marvel. He was kind of the closer, and they wanted to do Buck Rogers. That was the first time I met him. It had to be 78, 79. It was pretty early on. Would be maybe 80, but I mean, it was that period. It was before I was in the animation business.
So I'm gonna move on. I got my soapbox, the Transformer soapbox.
Well, I mean, and we can because I know we've gone a long time. I can come back. I mean, this is fun.
No, I have a couple of things I want to get to.
Talks about what?
I have a few things I want to get to before I end this, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, let's go to like what I have is 5-year time, right? Were you?
Yeah, that's fine. We got about 25 minutes.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna try and get through this real fast. All these things. So then you got one of those lucky parties again with Judy Price. You got to work on Tiny Toons with Steven Spielberg.
Oh, that was Lisa Henson. That was Jim Henson's daughter. I met Lisa Henson at a party.
Oh.
And I was talking about it, but Judy Price was with Garbage Pail Kids.
Oh, shoot.
He was the head of the network. And I was literally like failing miserably at Garbage Pail Kids and went to a party invited by Michael Chase Walker, who was the guy who got me hired at CBS to do Garbage Pail Kids, but then subsequently left. Saw him recently. They were doing a reunion of Last Unicorn. And but went to this party of some, like new comedian. I don't even know who it was. And there was the launch party for him. It was at the air hangar at Santa Monica Airport. It was a Hollywood launch party. And I went there with my girlfriend at that point. It was Linda Wolverton, right? And she goes and she's talking to some bald guy, and I think this guy hitting on my girlfriend. Meanwhile, I'm introduced to Lisa Henson, who I think I didn't. What I knew was it was Jim Henson's daughter, and somehow we got to talking about Achilles' shield and the Iliad. I'm not making this up. You're sitting at a Hollywood party talking about the Iliad, and because that's what she wrote her thesis at Harvard. And I'm quite sure I was the only person in Hollywood that knew what Achilles' shield was like. Because it's not like we think it's like what it was. There wasn't some picture of a Gorgon or anything. It was like everything about the Greek civilization they were fighting for. It was like, olive trees and fishermen and so like that. But anyway, we were talking about that. And at the end of the party, she said, I said I had an animation writer. We have an animation project. And she said, we want to do a thing of the kid version of the Looney Tunes. And I said, I'm not really a comedy writer. I got to be honest. And she said, yeah, you are. And boom. Yeah, and the next day I'm, heading in to pitch it over. It feels like the next day. It was probably a week later, but I'm pitching over at Amblin. And then Linda, the guy she's talking to, turned out to be Charlie Fink. He was the head of animation at Disney. And when we drive away that night, she's being pitched the kid version of the Disney characters. I'm doing the kid version of the Warner characters. Then she later went on to do Beauty and the Beast and Lion King and Maleficent and done quite well for herself.
So we're going to jump a little bit because
you
have Agent 13 through TSR Books. You have Sagard
through Simon and Schuster.
Pick a path adventure type series.
Yep.
So those are two.
Gary and I wrote those together.
Those are two ongoing projects that you've been doing for years.
Yeah, well, I mean, Agent 13, Marconi and I always talk about finishing the third one, which is Overlords of the Underworld, which would be like, pulp fantasy, secret agent pulp meets Inhumanoids is about what that is. So we'll, that will one day or another get done. And then Sagard want to reprint those at the very least. It's always been held up by Gary's widow, who just is difficult to make deals with. Um, so we'll see. You'll see what happens with that. But I think we can just do it as long as I share the proceeds with her.
So you have a couple of new projects, Captain Trademark and Techno Dragon, you wanted to talk about?
Well, yeah, I know Captain Trademark. Yeah, though I was just telling you about that because you'll start hearing about it. That's actually a really funny thing. It's like it's this amalgam of it's a thing Paul Dini and I came up with in the day. He was probably at Lucasfilm and I was probably at Sunbow and we came up with it. But it was sort of this amalgam of all these silly projects we got sent on. We get hired by some new toy company or some new animation company to develop something, and you never know what happened to it. And now it looks like some of it actually got made, and the toys are sitting in a landfill, and people are finding bits and pieces of them. The episodes are in various different things, so I'll keep you abreast of what's happening with that. But that's just a fascinating like backbeat of all this. And Paul and I decided, hey, let's do a game of what we think happened. So we got a board card game, Captain Trademark, and we actually want to bring those characters to life. Some were good, and since we never got paid for them, and people went out of business doing them. There are characters, so we want to do something with them. But Captain Trademark was a gag in that because everybody's talking about everything being pre-sold. Everything has to be pre-sold. So we created Captain Trademark and his amazing pre-sold warriors. And we wrote it up just sarcastically in a Bible, because you just put placeholder names in there and you go figure it out later on.
Yeah.
And I think we were Trader Mix that night or something. But the point is that we ended up turning it in without changing the name.
Oh, no.
Imagine.
And then reading this and they're like, what the hell is this?
Yeah. There's this female character, F-Bomb, who's basically got Tourette's.
Oh,
I mean, we were just doing like all the stuff you couldn't do in cartoons, but sometimes you do that just to shake yourself out.
yeah.
And then you go back and later on fix it and clean it up. But the version before we cleaned it out got out there. And then we just merged it with a bunch of other stuff that never happened. And so that's our new product line. And then we'll see whether people are turning up the stuff we actually did. And other people did the same thing. I mean, like Buzz, Doug, all those guys in the day wrote all these developments, and you never know what would happen to them. And you just kind of forget about them. I remember I was this was when I was working with Steven, and he and I were walking through Hasbro at Toy Fair, their showroom, their own whole building at this point, right?
Yep.
And I started hearing this song, and the lyrics are like really familiar. I'm going, what is this? And I realized that I'd written the pilot and a couple other scripts for Pirates of Dark Water. And it was the whole gag was it was like a pirate shanty, but if you listen to it and you put all the verses together, it was where the clue to where the treasure was hidden. That was the gag. But they actually turned it into a theme song for it. And I'm listening to this, and it's dawning on me later on, I wrote that. Because you just do these projects and forget all about them. I was probably working on that for a month, maybe.
Wow.
And just did it. And then, I was probably writing movies, or I don't know what I was doing at that point, but, all of a sudden it comes. But so there's all the stuff you do, you forget about it. And then later on, and Paul and I just been compiling, and we found I had to clean out all my storage. We had a leak, a flood basically in our storage area. And so I had to clean out all the boxes of old stuff. And I found just like tons of old stuff.
Wow.
I haven't really categorized it or anything. Yeah, I mean, some of it, my wife, I had all these like Transformer posters from our office, and we did it, and all sorts of stuff. And my wife said, "Just throw it in the dumpster." I said, "No, fans are going to want this stuff," and she said, "No." And I have a friend who was really good with eBay, and he wanted to make some bucks, so I said, "Okay, fine, you get 30%." And like $70,000 later or something, my wife agreed that this stuff wasn't worthless, and I kept everything at sentimental value or that I felt like I didn't really own. Like I found like the 2 scripts for the second season of Humanoids that never got made, stuff like that, but that's not really mine. So I didn't sell that, but but so yeah, a lot of people were happy. I gave a lot of it away too.
Wow. That's stuff you should be selling at conventions at your booth.
Well, yeah, humor's too. Yeah, except I don't have booth at conventions, and I hate selling stuff to people, and I just am not capable of doing that. But yes, yeah, probably. But a lot of it. I mean, it got out there. It got to the right people. People were thrilled to get this stuff. Weird stuff was valuable. It was like a TSR financial report from '79 for $3,500. There was a press kit for the movie, Transformer movie.
Now
And I'm
that's
quite sure what happened with that. Hildy walks into my office, throws it on my desk, slides off, falls on the floor. And when I moved out of the office, I just threw it in a box and all that and find it all those years later. And like people were really happy to get stuff like that.
yes.
I mean, that was one of those situations where everybody won.
Yeah.
For the first time ever, my wife had to admit I was right. That was
Ah. Flint, it has been a wonderful, wonderful pleasure going down memory lane with you. I hope this wasn't too difficult.
no. I'm having a lot of fun. We were talking about stuff I've never really talked about before, to be honest with you. So that's great.
I try to make it more interesting than the average interview.
Oh, it's great. Well, obviously you did your work. I'm sitting here looking at like everything from Buck Rogers stuff to Mr. T. I mean, that's a pretty wide range of my life in that period.
Well, I try to do my research, but I don't want it to be boring for the viewers, and I don't want it to be boring for you. So I try to do my research. I try to research 3 or 4 different places to get cross reference so I can get a good pollination of information. That's why
You did a great job of it. Because I mean, again, we got just things I never talk about. I mean, that's great. I mean, everybody asks you about killing Optimus Prime. It's like, okay, but I mean, this is like different stuff. What you ought to get is a T-shirt. I'm looking at that Transformers cover. You see the box net behind you, with the Matrix on it.
Oh, the Matrix.
That ought to be the T-shirt, right? Where the chest cavity has the Matrix in it, right?
I bet they have that. I bet there's a T-shirt of that.
But I was looking at it and I was thinking, yeah, you ought to have that on the front of your shirt.
I think you're right. But that's the box set that was done by Shout Factory probably about 15 years ago.
They did a great job. Yeah, was that the 20th anniversary version?
I think it is.
They had Nelson.
25th.
Yeah, 25th. Yeah, Nelson and Sue Blue and I were all there.
You're on the documentaries for that.
Yeah, the documentary. Yeah, watching it.
Yep. And so, you've done so much work, and it's just I'm only touching the tip of the iceberg.
Next time I'll do the 90s.
So it's just you got so many projects. You're always doing stuff. You've always got 3 irons in the fire, as I think you quoted.
You have, if you're gonna have a career, you have to, because it's like if 30% of the stuff you do gets made, that you're doing great. I mean, that would be great. So for everything there's all the stuff that didn't happen. That's why Paul and I decided we'd just get all the stuff. It was probably just as good as the stuff we did for the 80s. Let's put it all together and get Trapped to Captain Trademark back going.
So the problem with a lot of this work and stuff like that is you have to keep yourself excited. You have to keep yourself interested in the work, and you've spoken about this garbage time or this downtime or this time where you can really reinvigorate yourself and come up with new projects. Maybe that's similar to going back and looking at your old stuff. I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, because what it is like, you have all these things that are either projects you have unfinished business with. I mean, Subterraneans is basically about 4 different projects that one reason or another I just wasn't done with. It's a little bit Agent 13. It's a little bit Inhumanoids. It's oddly enough a little bit Visionaries. It's a little bit a project I was doing with Stan Winston, and you glue it all together, and that's its own project, right? Because you got to kind of put stuff to rest, and some stuff sticks with you, and you keep working on it. Other stuff, it's just a new idea, and I'm just lucky in that pretty much, there's a lot of stuff that interests me, and I can sustain it for a certain amount of time. I mean, almost anything is interesting if it's anywhere near my range. Like the outer edge of my range, certainly Tiny Toons and Fievel are at the outer edge of my range there. Because I mean, they're much more comedy
What's the well, I get you haven't reached the other edge, I don't think, because you've done some dark stuff and you've done some
yeah, okay. So one end, the dark end would, I don't even know what the darkest of the dark end, but horror, the horror stuff I've done. Yeah, Terror Tracks, or the original design document that ended up being the movie Venom, really came from a game design document called Backwater, which was one of these documents that everybody wanted it. So that would be at the far nasty edge. And then DARPA's at another edge, that stuff, and the Intel community stuff. Probably the Geo stuff for Niantic would be at another corner. But yeah, it's a bunch of different. It's somewhere in that box. I can function.
You got a big box.
Yeah, but it's yes. I don't think I could have written Barbie. Let me put it that way. That was outside of my range.
Okay. But so then, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule.
That's great. And if you got more stuff to ask, I can come back.
I would like to see you sometime at a convention. I know you do make appearances from time to time at TFCon and other conventions. Is there anything coming up?
Certainly TFCon in Burbank or Pasadena or wherever they have it. Burbank. I'm almost always there. I've been to Comic-Con, leave COVID out of this, I think like 35 of the last 36 years, 34 of the last 36 years. And so it's, I always find something to do there. So I will see you at a convention.
I would hope to see you maybe at Joe Fest one of these years if we can.
What's really funny is in my mind, I did as much work on G.I. Joe as I did on Transformers. I'm just much more remembered for Transformers. But that's just the way the world deals with it. It's not necessarily how it happened in the real world.
But that's how the world is. It changes, twists, and you kind of amalgamate it the way that we want it to. That's how all stuff in life is. Things that you would never expect to be popular is things that you expect to be popular isn't popular.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you just have to keep getting lucky.
Yep. Well,
all right.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's been fun and happy to come back if you have more.
I really appreciate it. Thank you, Flint. It's been a pleasure. And for you viewers out there, we will see you next time.
Oh, send me a link to this too when you get a chance.
Yeah, sure. Is there a place that fans can maybe reach you to talk to you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm eminently reachable on Facebook. To be honest with you, that's probably the best place. Okay. Just because I'm around and there's a large Transformer community there. All and right. I check, and, I'm getting better about it. I don't do a lot of social media, but I'm getting better. I'm on most stuff. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, but Facebook's just the easiest place for this kind of stuff.
I don't want to keep going on, but it's weird that a lot of the guys that you worked with, you keep saying that you were in this box or this tunnel or whatever. A lot of the guys that were with you are in the same position. They don't know a lot of the stuff that's going on, and they're trying to get themselves back out into the social media to talk to the fans. And it's weird. I'm like, you guys must have really been working hard.
Social media. I just don't like TikTok for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with TikTok. But Instagram's just not really my thing. So I mean, in Facebook, I just got sick of it, but I realized you got to do it. And LinkedIn, just everybody tells you have to be on LinkedIn, so I'm on LinkedIn. And I'm on Twitter. I didn't really ever get Twitter, but I'm there. What can I tell you?
That's fine. So thank you, and we will talk to you next time, guys out there.
Perfect. Talk to you later.
Bye.